we'll kick things off with the next talk. It's Bryon Killian. He's a wastewater operator. He's a PE, and he's an NTEC principal, but he's also my boss. So Bryon's been with NTEC for 18 years, and joining him is Dan Fortak. He recently joined NTEC as an environmental engineering designer, and he did a lot of research for this presentation. Things are changing every day, so I can't wait to see. This is something we're all very interested in with wastewater sampling and tracking COVID-19. So gentlemen, kick it off.
Great, thanks, Christine. Some of the topics that will be explored today, wastewater industry response to COVID-19, how effective are treatment processes, and tracking the virus that causes COVID-19 in wastewater. Even though we live in a time of uncertainty, Dan and I will try to provide a little clarity and facts about what we've learned about COVID-19 as of today. Things, of course, are already rapidly changing. The effects on wastewater and our industry, as well as novel ways being developed to track the virus using wastewater surveillance, and how these could help lessen the effects of the pandemic. As many of the speakers did today, we do have a disclaimer. Neither Dan or I are epidemiologists, and this short presentation is more of a summary of a lot of information being presented by the CDC, EPA, and other research companies, as well as some private companies. And some of the information that Dan and I learned from people actually doing the testing. To nobody's surprise, the EPA suggested to governors of all states and territories that the wastewater industry should be considered essential during the pandemic. Operations of the treatment plants continue to provide vital services to the public with no major interruptions at all. No major changes to treatment or operational procedures were presented to deal with COVID. When the governor issued the stay-at-home orders, I know my phone was ringing off the hook, asking about needing standby operators in case anybody's certified operators were exposed to the virus, let alone get it, the virus. And it really stressed to me the importance of having relationships with other wastewater treatment plants, relationship with contract operators, and also having trained available operators available on staff. A lot of people that we have talked to, they really just had no other backup plan besides their 1 or 2 certified operators. To that extent, we actually, NTEC put out a COVID-19 water and wastewater utility best practices checklist blog back in early March. That's been that long ago, that identified such things as an A team and a B team, making sure that you have one operator, certified operator, riding around in a vehicle, not having both of your operators in the same vehicle, stuff like that. It was really to tighten up the safety procedures that really should have been in place when you're dealing with untreated wastewater to begin with. But it's a great little blog. It's on our website if anybody's interested. So how effective are treatment processes? The standard treatment and disinfection processes at wastewater treatment plants are expected to be effective against the virus. Therefore, our effluent that we're putting out, millions and millions of gallons a day, are treated, and we have no concern for the virus at this point in time. Coronavirus does not survive in chlorinated water and is very susceptible to UV light, including sunlight. So everybody's pretty happy that we can actually treat the wastewater and make sure that we're not causing infection in our effluent. But what about the raw wastewater? The CDC reported in late May of 2020 that recently the virus that causes COVID-19 has been found in untreated wastewater. While data is limited, and I do stress limited, there is no information to date that anyone has become sick with COVID-19 because of exposure to wastewater. And like Christine mentioned earlier in one of the presentations, that people do know of wastewater operators who did get COVID, and that does still happen. They just don't have any evidence that it's because of the exposure to wastewater. I do find it a little odd what the CDC put out was on May 28th, 2020. They said that the statement is now 2 months old, and they're very clear that no information to date. So I thought that was kind of interesting that it's 2 months old and it was never updated yet. So I think they're being cautious of new information that they're putting out. What about the raw wastewater? The CDC, I'm sorry, let me jump back. The CDC also published that the standard practices associated with wastewater operations should be sufficient to protect wastewater workers from the virus that causes COVID-19. These standard practices include engineering and administration controls, hygiene precautions, special safe work practices, whatever that means, and PPE, normally required when handling untreated wastewater. No additional COVID-19 special precautions were recommended by the CDC for workers involved in wastewater management, including these at the wastewater treatment facilities. All right, wait, Bryon. You just told me that they found a virus. It's definitely in wastewater. So we have the virus that causes COVID-19 in untreated wastewater, but no information to date anyone has been sick with COVID because of the closure of wastewater. Is this pure luck? Everybody's just lucky? Truth be told, maybe. That might be the case. But the tracking of COVID is looking for RNA in a virus particle through PCR detection. PCR detection, although this says that there's definitely RNA in there, does not necessarily mean the virus is still infectious. According to the CDC on 7/15/20, it remains unclear, and I do stress unclear, whether the virus in feces is infectious. And the way I kind of thought about it, I kind of wrapped my brain around it, and I heard in one presentation where they described it, was, you have such things as a spike glycoprotein and a membrane protein. Just because they find the RNA doesn't mean the virus itself, the virus particle itself, is not damaged. So they have the RNA, fine, but that does not mean it's necessarily infectious. Doesn't mean it necessarily isn't either through the PCR methods. The PCR detection method, I've read about 3 or 4 different times, and I still wasn't 100% getting it. So actually, I'm going to ask Dan to maybe summarize it a little bit better.
Well, thank you, Bryon. Well, basically, for coronavirus detection in wastewater, they use a method called qPCR, which is quantitative polymerase chain reaction. It's basically taking a sample and using changes of temperature to amplify, well, with PCR you could do DNA or RNA, but in this case it would be the RNA, and you're amplifying it to a large amount in the sample, and you could use that to pretty much, you could study it on a larger scale.
Now you understand why I had Dan explain that. He explained that to me several times, and I still didn't get it. So thank you, Dan. I appreciate the explanation. Whoops. The data is limited, as I stressed before. Almost every solution for controlling the disease includes more testing and data. As of July 27th, which was yesterday, CDC reports total testing data in the U.S. to be 52,942,145 total tests. Of that, the positive tests was 5,046,506. So it's approximately a 10% positive test. And the U.S. population is right around 322,200,000. To kind of give a little background, Pennsylvania has performed about 1,568,674 tests with a 6 to 10% positive result. If the total number of tests that was done since this all started was conducted on a single day, on one day, we would only test approximately 14% of the U.S. population. The total number, of course, also includes individuals getting tested multiple times. I'm a big fan of the Joe Rogan podcast, and I know he was talked about how many numerous tests he got during one UFC fight, so that doesn't necessarily equate, but just kind of round numbers. So based upon that, individual testing is limited and definitely cost prohibitive. And the pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic people possibly spreading the virus, of course, aren't typically going to get tested on their own. So, however, testing individuals is currently the only way to find out who is infected, isolate them, and trace their contacts. I just heard a recent story. My ex-sister-in-law and my niece were down the beach in Ocean City, Maryland, and they got a phone call that one of the workers at the restaurant they were at actually tested positive for coronavirus, and they were able to trace them, of course, through her credit card. So that's why I'm a little skeptical on this coin shortage thing. I think it's more of a tracking thing, but that might go a little bit deep state for you. Testing individuals is currently the only way to find out who's affected. We need an alternate approach to understand transmission trends in communities, such as tracking coronavirus and wastewater. Like I mentioned, virus can be present in the domestic wastewater for 2 to 5 days before it's treated at a wastewater treatment plant. Okay, Bryon, that's great for somebody who has the community wastewater system, but what about the other people? Actually, 75 to 80% of Americans are connected to community sewer systems that represent a pooled sample of urine, feces, and gray matter for that community. So although it's not 100%, it's quite a bit of our population that's actually connected to community sewer systems. So a lot of great information is going to be able to be maintained. So who's doing this? There's dozens of researchers across the US and actually worldwide that are tracking COVID-19 in wastewater. Many states are considering mandating wastewater utility monitoring. Tracking data is currently becoming available in numerous states, including PA, which ultimately will be made available through the CDC and their website. So the wastewater-based epidemiology, which is the science of studying community sewage for public health information, is just one method of getting information about community health and actually narcotics usage as well. I thought this was really interesting. It's a little bit of a sidebar to the COVID, but the drug testing wastewater was first proposed in 2001 by a scientist from the EPA, hoping to raise awareness of the impact that drugs can have on a community. The illegal drugs and or metabolites that are most often studied with wastewater-based approaches are MDMA, which is also known as Molly, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines, cannabis. To point that the city of Tempe, Arizona is using all of this drug data for educational efforts in the community and then also to measure the progress towards their goal to end opiate deaths / overdoses by 2025. Although it's not typical, they can also measure things such as alcohol. I joked with my wife and I said, I want to make sure I send my son to meth university to make sure he doesn't go there. So we're going to follow along and see what universities are tracking as well. Dan?
Thank you, Bryon.
And actually, Dan, before you get started, I want to let you all know the password for this talk is sludge. That's sludge. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, thank you, Bryon and Christine. Bryon talked a little bit about the characteristics of wastewater and started talking about tracking and how it's being used around the world and in the US. And basically, this is a diagram of a community wastewater system with a sample being collected. So you have community wastewater that's being taken to the wastewater treatment plant, and it's either at an influent pump station or at the headworks where you have a sample that's collected. And with that sample that's collected, pretty much that's sent over to a lab. Most cases, it's not done in-house as of currently, but and this is an example of a form of testing that could be done at universities, nursing homes, or prisons, where you have a very similar population, and it's very beneficial in determining whether, the course of the disease or whether the disease is actually spreading. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is another graph from the city of Tempe, Arizona, which basically the chart actually explains how the city decision-making process is taking into account testing. So you have wastewater that's collected and analyzed for biomarkers, and then you have a city decision-making and planning process, and they develop and implement new strategies, analyze outcomes and impact on community health, and adjust or continue strategies. And it's an ongoing cycle. Like Bryon mentioned before, the new data is coming in about COVID-19. So there's always something new to learn and adapt in terms of the wastewater treatment and health initiatives. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about two different case studies locally in Pennsylvania. There's one currently at Capital Region Water in Harrisburg in Dauphin County, and that's actually at a plant that's about 22 million gallons per day, and it has a coverage area of about 130,000 customers. And pretty much CRW entered a program with a company called BioBot, which is a pretty expensive way, but you grab a sample using a 24-hour composite sample, and you send it over to a lab. And I think the cost was about $1,100. But initially, they were one of the only labs doing sampling for COVID-19. And as a result, they got inundated with testing, and they were sort of, their own success had issues with the vast, pretty much the vastness of the program. But next slide, please. And on May 5th, there were about 695 cases confirmed for COVID-19. And on May 12th, there were about 851 in Dauphin County. And one of the things with wastewater surveillance, the results actually indicated the presence of COVID-19 could be 10 times higher than official testing in Dauphin County. And I think it was in a recent CDC webinar, they reported that you can have sewage concentrations correlate with confirmed cases approximately 4 to 6 days in advance when you do wastewater sampling and testing for COVID-19. And next slide, please. So this is another example of wastewater sampling. This is actually at Kendall Crosslands Retirement Community in Kennett Square in Chester County. And the uniqueness of this is that the wastewater treatment plant only serves that community. So the data that they get, it's sort of equating it as if you were in a college or an institution or like a prison. You're basically getting samples from that specific area. So it's easier to take that data and pretty much use it in regards to the community's health. And the results are very specific in that regard. And that could potentially save lives at a smaller community. And they initially used BioBot's testing. However, Bryon recently told me that they moved over to a company in Florida, because I think the cost was about $1,100 per sample, and the company in Florida has a faster turnaround in a few days, and the cost is approximately $315. And next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So some of the benefits of wastewater surveillance being used, it can be used to determine whether COVID-19 is present in the geographic area. Like I said before, even as cases weren't reported yet. And it's a lot of times now it's going into the phase where it could be used as an early warning system. And it can assist faster response to a pandemic. And one of the benefits is that wastewater surveillance allows you to collect a sample in a more controlled environment, as opposed to testing a population individually, because it reduces the risk for infection, because the wastewater system is very secure in terms of the way waste is handled, and pretty much it doesn't really expose the public to a lot of risk. And like I said, it can assist pretty much with the reopening in the future if there was another wave or another pandemic. And as well as in terms of testing, there's a few companies that are also using another system in terms of assays, but I'm gonna go on to that in the next slide. And it could be an asset to an organization, and it could help determine whether to loosen restrictions, as I said before, in an economy, potentially reducing economic losses. And some of these losses could be in the hundreds of millions of dollars potentially. And it's faster, and it's more, it takes less time than like I said, with individual testing on a large scale. Next slide, please. And technologies such as qPCR are used by companies like BioBot. currently they're pretty slow and they're very expensive. It's sometimes even with a turnaround of a few days, you're losing time. But there's assay techniques that are currently being developed. There's actually a university out in the United Kingdom that's developing where you could pre-test the water, reduce the cost, and it could be deployed faster because you can have an on-site operator take care of the testing. And in terms of, you could reduce the number of days to perhaps minutes or hours for the test. And that's the goal, as well as the cost. But the CDC is looking to implement a national wastewater surveillance system as well, with all this data that we're obtaining from different wastewater treatment plants across the country. And the goal is to have this up and running in about 6 to 18 months. So perhaps this could help in terms of planning for a next wave or a new virus. But hopefully by that time, we won't really have to worry about that virus will be over. Well, this is the end of the presentation, and I appreciate your time and for observing our presentation. And if you have any, I'll open this up to questions.
And the one thing I want to add, I mean, there's quite a bit of information on here. We did put some of the places where we obtained some of this information on the slide deck for further reading. It really was a rabbit hole when he started diving into this. It took you from one site to the next site and looking at the statistics, which are changing constantly. It's definitely something that will be outdated the second you probably learn about it, because it is changing so rapidly. I mean, there's been such an advance even within the last month on where this is headed, the techniques, the CDC's stance on everything, and they're still trying to figure things out as well. So it's quite a bit of future reading if you're interested in the topic.
And like Bryon said, we started this presentation a few weeks ago, but as the pandemic was going on, we were constantly updating it because the information is coming out almost on the hourly basis.
Yeah, so open it up to questions. You guys are welcome to either post it via the chat or just unmute yourself and pose any questions that you have about this very interesting topic. Anybody? Okay, well, as usual, I've got questions. So, Bryon, you'd mentioned that going all the way back to 2001 was when they first started tracing different drugs and stuff in wastewater. So, I mean, it seems like they got experience doing this for a long time. So I was pleased to hear that basically just using technology in ways they've used it already. Yes, so I forget where I was going with that question. So you mentioned there's two different places we know of here in Pennsylvania that are looking at testing. And I assume lots more will probably be jumping on board and checking out that sort of thing?
I think so. And I think eventually, depending upon the results and where this technology goes, I think it's going to become mandatory personally. I think states are going to mandate all the treatment plants to comply, especially if we get some techniques that are a lot cheaper and a lot more readily available.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing over time, just how costs drop and make it much more cost effective for people to be able to do it. And then actually that speaks to future pandemics that we have, future problems. Hopefully use the same sort of techniques and technology to be able to circumvent those, or at least track them and trace them.
In my head, in my conspiracy head at least, how far can this go? I mean, they can go from the headworks, now they go to the pump station, now they go to the manhole upstream of your house, then they go to your lateral. I mean, eventually I think there's going to be some craziness that falls behind it. Even when they were doing those drug studies in Tempe, there was people questioning the legality of it and the ethics behind it.
That's a good question. I mean, is it legal for them to test your wastewater?
Everything's legal right now.
It's one of those things where it's sort of new technology and a lot of people don't know it's possible, and it's gray. It's a gray area, I guess, until it goes to someone takes it to court, then you'll see.
Is the gray area, is that a pun intended?
You caught me. We still have a couple minutes. Any other questions out there?
It seems like one of the biggest benefits for this is depending on, if they kind of optimize their turnaround for these testing. I mean, you can obviously look out ahead of this, and it's going to come down to being able to deploy resources to exactly where they're going to be needed. And if you can take any kind of mitigation, actions, just like, you guys were referring to. Can you narrow it down to a retirement community, a prison, any kind of institution? Well, you can plug in, some action items there, restricting visitors, things of that sort.
Well, each day would just cut out, but he made me realize that if you're doing testing, essentially, I guess you have to test every day then to be able to track and see if there's peaks and not.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Right now, they're typically tested once a week.
What, once a week? Okay. Okay.
So once a week. I mean, but is that enough? I mean, they're doing it once a week based upon economic reasons.
Yep. And if costs go way down, then you can do it daily. Interesting.
Christine, I think as the tests get better also, like with the assay testing that's being developed in the UK, I think that's definitely going to bring costs down where a wastewater treatment plant operator can perform the test within minutes or even hours.
Okay, what does the word assay mean? Because when I looked at your slideshow, I'm like, oh, he misspelled something, but I just left it. So what is it?
It's pretty much basically what they're doing is they're doing what qPCR does on a large scale, and they're trying to amplify the amount of RNA in the sample. And I guess they're using some kind of light meter to determine the amount in the sample, and they're able to, from that analysis, they're able to scale it up to the population of the area and determine what percentage of people might have COVID or another disease.
Okay, got it. Okay, any other questions or just comments on this interesting topic? Okay, excellent. So,
Thanks, guys.
thank you so much, Bryon. We appreciate it.